Welcome back to class. This is Introduction to Political Ideas, and I'm Ken Hicks. We've been talking about conservatism as a political ideology. As an ideology, conservatism has roots that go all the way back to the ancient world. Most ancient societies were kind of organized around religious rituals and myths that, I think you could argue had conservative implications. But as an ideology, conservatism really emerges in modernity. It emerges as a sort of protest against the Enlightenment and against the challenges of some of the central institutions that conservatives value, in particular the systems of kind of social stratification that emerged with feudalism, but also importantly with the ideas around the power of religion, over secular life. We've been talking about kind of the earlier manifestations of conservatism. We spoke about Edmund Burke as an early sort of exemplar of conservatism as we understand it today, as sort of, again, this idea that we should be protecting the little platoons of society, family, church, family, local governments, churches, as again important sources of meaning for individuals. We've also begun talking about how the Napoleonic Wars and the fracturing of the feudal European political order, gave rise to what is now, what we describe as reactionary conservatism. This idea that we have to go back to some earlier period of time. Today, we're moving forward, and we're going to start talking about conservatism as it emerges in the 19th century. Again, as sort of a complaint not only against the Enlightenment and against the emerging liberal political order, but also against capitalism. And then we're going to talk a little bit about conservatism in the 20th century and how you really begin to see, I mentioned in the my first presentation, conservatism is more of a disposition than it is some set of hard and fast principles. You don't get a recipe for what it takes to be conservatives. Although we'll begin to look and see, some variants of conservatism, as it has emerged in contemporary politics. But again, 20th century conservatism is a mix of different kinds of conservatives. So let's start with cultural conservatism. And this emerges, again, the Enlightenment is this emphasis on, individual rationality, belief that science is the most stable source of knowledge. Cultural conservatism emerges with the Romanticist era, okay? This is an important cultural movement among artists and poets in Europe and in America in the 19th century. There's this emphasis on emotion, imagination, individualism, and the love of nature. The American Transcendentalists were important kind of aspect of this movement. There was certainly an initial enthusiasm for the French Revolution among many Romanticists. It was very tempered by the horrors of the Reign of Terror. Capitalism and materialism kind of emerged as the enemy of spirituality and culture. One of the great articulators of cultural conservatism was the English poet William Wordsworth, who was again a Romanticist. In 1806, he condemned materialism this way. The world is too much with us late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste to our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. Basically, again, saying that this constant emphasis on consumerism and materialism was wasting us and starving us for the things that really matter. So cultural conservatism provided a powerful basis of support for the Tory party, for the Conservative Party in English electoral politics. And this gives rise to kind of, again, this another expression of conservatism. You had, again, a roughly two-party system in England in this period. The Tories on the one side were the party of the aristocracy. The Whigs were the party of the emerging and very wealthy, merchant classes. The dramatic expansion of the franchise to British working class, folks, men in particular, women didn't get the vote until a bit later, was viewed as a potentially destabilizing development. A lot of people among the Tories were very concerned that the expansion of the franchise would mean the death of their ability to compete in electoral politics. For the Tories, their solution was not to attempt to suppress the votes of working class voters. It was instead to reach out to them. They appealed to the traditions of the crown. They appealed to the traditions of the British noble classes as protectors of English culture and traditions, and they pointed to the increasingly harsh working conditions of the merchant classes and the factories in which they worked, and said, look, we can help you with this. We can get you better labor conditions. We can get you, we can compel the merchants to give you better working conditions and better wages. And so the Tories, as much as anything, particularly in England, were largely responsible for the construction of the welfare state. Over time, the Tories would kind of morph into what we today would call the Conservative Party. They're still called the Tories every now and then. The Whigs would eventually become what is now the Liberal Party in England, and they are sort of the third party. And the Labour Party is now sort of the party of it's sort of a social democratic party today. And so in the United States, conservatism really took a fundamentally different shape. There were no feudal institutions for conservatives to seek, for American conservatives to seek to preserve. And both political parties at times gave evidence of conservatism. In fact, I've made the argument in other classes and perhaps even in this class that the American party system was unique in that both of the political parties, as they emerged, initially as the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and then as the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and then eventually as the Democrats and the Republicans, they were catch-all parties, which means that they were not ideologically driven. They weren't making expressly ideological appeals. Both parties were what we would call, again, big tent parties, where they had different factions in different parts of the country. And the result was American political parties had typically a conservative and a moderate and a liberal wing, if you will. And it's really not until well into the 20th century that first the Democratic Party begins making more express appeals to liberalism, and that kind of compels at a later date the Republican Party to move in a more ideologically conservative direction. Both political parties are pretty consistently ideological these days. The Democratic Party is increasingly a moderate to liberal party, and then there are, in fact, some social democrats in the Democratic Party. And the Republican Party is increasingly a moderate to ideologically conservative party. And so that was not the case back then. And so you had the sometimes conservatism of American Federalists like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. But eventually you get the emergence of what we would call a commercial aristocracy in the Northeast, and you have the literary Whigs like Rufus Choate and Daniel Webster that are attempting to articulate what it means to be an American conservative. There is also a conservative strain in America's literary tradition. Both Herman Melville and Nathaniel Hawthorne, again, give evidence to this attempt And they were kind of romanticist writers as well. One of the great romanticists, the origin of horror comes from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And what is the point of Frankenstein? It is this sense in which humanity is daring to try to do things that it ought not do, right? I mean, what is the central theme of Frankenstein? It is the possibility of humans defeating death. For conservatives, that is a dangerous aspiration, and that is sort of the point. The subtitle of Frankenstein is Prometheus Unbound, and that is the sense in which humanity, in its aspirations, can do more damage than good. And so that is an important aspect, I think, and it's something that flows very easily into a conservative political viewpoint. So why is liberalism elsewhere considered conservatism in the United States? And again, American conservatives have always stressed the sanctity of private property, which is widely accepted among both conservatives and liberals. You have the emergence of welfare liberalism and the Great Schism, with critics of welfarism moving ideologically more to the right in the United States, where again, ironically, owing to Tory democracy, welfarism in Great Britain is largely authored by conservatives. So you have this essential tension in the United States between cultural conservatives who view ideological conservatism as a platform for the defense of laissez-faire capitalism, and then you have more folks that are pushing in a more overtly libertarian direction. So you have a conflation oftentimes with social Darwinism with ideologically conservative perspectives in the United States. And again, that is this whole sense of the survival of the fittest. I mentioned William Graham Sumner's arguments that a drunkard in the gutter is precisely where he belongs. I think a conservative would largely agree with that. A lot of conservatives' hostility to civil rights is predicated on the idea that any attempts by government to uplift people are not likely to be appreciated. The recently assassinated youth leader of Republicans basically said he thought that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a mistake. And keep in mind, recall what the Civil Rights Act was. It was a basic law forbidding, overt discrimination against blacks. He thought that was a mistake. A lot of, American conservatives like William F. Buckley agreed with him. So conservatism, as it moves into the 20th century, again, while conservatives continued to divide among themselves, they united in criticism of the emergence of what would be characterized as mass society in the 20th century. And so what about mass society, this sense in which by getting rid of the social stratification, the systems of ascribed status that separated lord from serf and from nobility from working class, the sense in which by expanding, for example, the vote and spreading public education, the institutions of welfare, that these are actually hurting us culturally. Basically, the argument is that from conservative perspectives, that the breakdown of social class distinctions and increased social mobility actually are tearing us away from important sources of meaning. That by moving in a more cosmopolitan direction, we lose those things about small town America, for example, of church and our local political institutions that again are oftentimes important sources of meaning. And so, the argument is that people within mass society are too weak to restrain themselves and too prone to manipulation to resist the appeal of demagogues. And so the fear is that people cut loose from their cultural and social moorings become like a mob, very prone to being ignited into riot by overt political appeals by selfish people seeking their own self-aggrandizement. One of the great early articulations of this idea is the revolt of the masses by a Spanish liberal philosopher by the name of Jose Ortega y Gasset. He was a Spanish liberal. He offered a qualified defense of the meritocratic liberalism of John Stuart Mill. If you recall, I mentioned that Mill at one point said that people with more educational attainment should have greater formal political power within a society. Ortega y Gasset made the argument that the mass does not wish to share life with those who are not of it. It has a deadly hatred of all that is not itself. And again, he's writing this in 1929 when fascism has already taken root in Italy, and where fascism is beginning to take root and advancing in leaps and bounds in Germany. And so the perception among conservatives is that fascism was a logical byproduct of mass society. And the only remedy was to entrust government to an aristocracy or some kind of trained elite. Another great concern is the idea that that social programs, that welfarism creates a leveling effect, and that gives evidence. One of the great kind of articulations of that is a series of columns written by George Will that was made into a book called The Leveling Wind, and again that gives expression to conservatives' skepticism regarding democratization or attempts to promote economic equality. Basically, conservatives of many stripes believe that society and the economy especially is a zero-sum game. I remember vividly on Meet the Press one morning, a conservative by the name of Grover Norquist making the argument that Social Security and other welfare programs are just like taking a bucket of water out of a pond, moving to another part of the stream, and then dumping the bucket back in. Essentially saying that it is useless, that any attempt at redistributing valuables, money and goods, is just a waste of time. And so conservatives view leveling as the enemy of variety and diversity, and that inevitably means the elimination of conservative communities. And effectively, conservatives argue that it creates a race to the bottom, where mass society produces moral relativism, which justifies wasteful and culturally barren policies. So conservatives are consistently hostile to most aspects of the New Deal and of the Great Society, the two great waves of social welfare programs that are a significant part of America's welfare system. Another expression of conservatism that emerged in the early part of the 20th century is what we might call the Southern agrarian movement, that was given voice by a book, by a series of a group of Southern poets and historians and professors called "I'll Take My Stand." And it was basically a movement in support of the Southern way of life, and in opposition to what they characterized as the prevailing way. This was a group that were known as the Fugitives. They were organized around Vanderbilt University. Most of them went to school there in Nashville, Tennessee. There was a later revival of Southern agrarianism centered around Chapel Hill, North Carolina. They basically were hostile to the idea of progress, particularly in the form of industrialization and finance. They had a real contempt for the money people. Remember in the 1930s, most of these folks who were white racial conservatives were Democrats, okay? And so there was this innate connection between agrarianism, and again, what is agrarianism? It is the arguments of the early Democratic Party, the Jeffersonian, Madisonian view that the society should be organized around the small farmer. Living in rural communities was the best pathway to what they believed was the most moral articulation of American individualism. And so again, they are making an implicit argument that integration implies a manifestation of leveling, and no one should be surprised that a good portion of American conservatism is connected to this anti-integrationist, basically segregationist viewpoint. Now, not all the agrarians were segregationists. Certainly Robert Penn Warren, who was the author of All the King's Men, which again is an allegorical tale of the charismatic fictional governor Willie Stark, who was obviously inspired by the real-life exploits of Louisiana Governor Huey Long. His contribution to I'll Take My Stand was an essay called The Briar Patch, which offered a defense of racial segregation. However, as Warren's fame grew, he actually stepped away from the agrarians for quite a period of time. When he re-engaged, he basically recanted on his earlier support for segregation and argued that for agrarianism to survive, it really needed to embrace racial integration. It needed to set racism aside in order to fulfill its true promise. One of the most consistent manifestations of conservatism, or one of the most consistent themes of conservatism in the 20th century, is a pronounced hostility to communism. In particular, now we'll learn more about this word communism when we get to our discussion of socialism in the coming weeks. For now, it's important to keep in mind. Socialism is based on a moral argument that economic inequality is immoral, and that capitalism is an unjust system of economic distribution. This is a thing, the idea of communism is basically an argument of Karl Marx that communism would represent this kind of final stage of human economic development in which all goods there was abundance and everyone had equal access to all the goods associated, all the goods needed for life and for human development. And so since 1917, certainly conservatives have been relatively uniform in denouncing communism. And again, communism becomes sort of a term of abuse within conservative rhetoric. Certainly as it was manifested in Russia and ultimately in China, Cuba, and elsewhere, North Korea and elsewhere. The vehemence of conservatives' opposition to communism has four basic kind of justifications. First, they believe that socialists are fundamentally mistaken in their belief in the unlimited capacity of human beings for improvement. Second, they believe that perfectibility of human nature and society is again similarly unrealistic. They reject the idea of communist concentration of power within the state. And that they basically argue that communism is inimical to diversity or variety, which conservatives believe is something that's worthy of preserving. And so again, the tendency of conservatives over the course of the 20th century is to conflate any expansion of government with socialism, which is ironic today because Donald Trump is behaving in enormously expansive ways. He has taken over part of American computer system, computer company. He is insisting on, he's taken enormous personal benefits from the creation of cryptocurrency in his name. He has threatened to intervene in numerous, government companies. He wanted to fire the head of which one was it? NVIDIA. He wanted to fire the CEO of that company. He has sued just about every media company available, and recently just compelled via a threat from the chairman of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, threatened to basically intimidated ABC into permanently suspending Jimmy Kimmel's late night program. These are all massive interventions by the government in the operations of privately owned companies. Conservatives have historically been enormously concerned about those kinds of interventions. Now, you could make the argument, well, isn't that an example of socialism or communism? I don't think it is, because obviously I think the primary point of Trump's interventions is his personal benefit, is his consolidation of power and authority, not only over companies, but over the sources of culture. These are to me very concerning developments. So anti-communism really emerges as a domestic basis for opposition to the New Deal over the course of the 1930s and the 1940s. And of course, keep in mind, in the 1940s, you saw the emergence of things like McCarthyism, which was an assault on government employees who were, accused by Joseph McCarthy, the Wisconsin senator, of being members of the Communist Party. So post-war American conservatism was energized by internal debates over how to proceed, because again, by the time you get to the post-war era, Democrats had been, pretty solidly in control from 1930, when Democrats won control of the House of Representatives, until the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And a lot of conservatives looked at the death of FDR as a real opportunity, and they began making real, wealthier Americans began making real investments in building an infrastructure of opposition to the Democratic Party's control of the political institutions. There was a diversity of views among American conservatives, from what we might describe as a sort of Burkean American, kind of American interpretation of Burkean traditional conservatism, to the John Birch Society, which was a conspiratorial conservative group that actually believed that Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, president of the United States, the first Republican president of the United States since Herbert Hoover in 1941 or 1933, who was the first Republican governor of a generation, that they believed he was a communist. These were some odd people, and so you get a lot of this kind of brought together in a mainstream conservative, one of the first conservative political magazines of the 20th century, which was the fusionist conservatism of the National Review. The founder of the National Review, William F. Buckley, believed that the best critics of communism were its defectors, and included on the board of the National Review ex-communists turned conservatives like Whittaker Chambers and Frank Meyer. So the magazine helped develop a kind of fusionist version of conservatism that drew on a variety of intellectual strands, including, like I said, Burkean traditionalism, Catholic intellectual thought, libertarians who are increasingly kind of gravitating towards, because they were invigorated in the post-war period as well, and these ex-communists. So one kind of important manifestation of conservatism emerges in the post-World War II era, and it comes, a good illustration of it is in the writings of the British philosopher Michael Oakeshott. And he wrote famously this essay called On Being Conservative. He was, again, a conservative philosopher and historian. He studied in Germany during the 1930s, which exposed him to Nazism. He served in World War II. He served with distinction in the Special Forces. Ultimately, he taught philosophy, history, and law at the London School of Economics. He generally had a tendency to avoid partisan politics. He really didn't fling himself into, kind of the day-to-day ideological battles in post-World War II Britain. But he was, in fact, a conservative, and he wrote this essay on what that means. And so for Oakeshott, conservatism is not a creed, but a disposition. Conservatism amounts to a preference to prefer certain kinds of conducts and certain conditions of human circumstances to others. I love this particular quotation. To be conservative is to prefer the familiar to the unknown, to prefer the tried to the untried, fact to mystery, the actual over the possible, the limited over the unbound, the near to the distant, the sufficient to the superabundant, the convenient to the perfect, present laughter over utopian bliss. And so again, this gives rise to the sense in which a conservative is sort of encoded, right? That there is just, certain people are wired in a way that they are more reluctant to experience, to rush to new experiences. And so we prefer those familiar relationships to the allure of relationships based on economic calculation. Again, Oakeshott would write, "What is esteemed is the present, and it is esteemed not on account of its connections with a remote antiquity, nor because it is recognized to be more admirable than any other possible alternative, but on account of its familiarity." And he reverts to German in order to kind of drive this home. He says, not "wer weil dort du bist und schon," which is to say in German, "Stay with me, you are so beautiful," but rather, "Stay with me because I am attached to you." And so for conservatives, change is, it's something that can be difficult. It's one thing that we note as we age. We have this tendency to struggle with change. Those of us of a certain generation have difficulty. I know many of my contemporaries do not like having a cell phone. My wife's stepfather routinely left his phone at home when he went out to go for coffee with his buddies, because and we would say it's not his forgetful memory. It's because he hates the darn thing. He doesn't want it on him. He doesn't want to constantly be monitored by his wife. He wants to have that freedom to be away from that technology. And he never would accept a cell phone that had access to the internet. His cell phone was a phone. That's all it did. Maybe it had a calculator on it, but that was about the only thing that it did for him. And so for a lot of conservatives, change is a kind of deprivation. And as a result, small and slow changes are far more tolerable than large and sudden changes. Changes have to be suffered, and conservatives can't be indifferent to those changes which are inevitable. But they shouldn't just open themselves up to all change and say, well, it's going to happen, For conservative, they would basically say, no. I want to be able to determine what changes I have to accept versus what changes I need not accept. And Oakeshott kind of lived that way. When he retired from the London School of Economics, he went out to the country and he just did his thing. He gardened and he, kind of hung around with people that he liked. His third wife. I should note, he was more of a special forces guy than, if you know anything about folks that serve in those kinds of military outfits. He was incredibly promiscuous over the course of his life and routinely got himself caught up in romantic entanglements with the wives and girlfriends of his students. He went through 2 divorces because of his various infidelities. But he was very much about, again, kind of, I want to live in the country. I want to live, kind of free of the distractions of this constantly changing urban life. He talks about the ideas of memory, right? Because changes threaten identity by offering a kind of extinction. He notes that the Maasai removal to reservation land in Kenya took with them they took with them the names of the hills and the ridges and the rivers of their ancestral lands. And he says that by the same subterfuge of conservatism, it is by the same subterfuge of conservatism that every man or people compelled to suffer a notable change avoids the shame of extinction. He talks about the idea of innovation. Innovation is an equivocal enterprise for conservatives. Again, he's basically arguing that even innovation, which may be a small change, is something about which most conservatives experience a kind of ambivalence. Gains and losses are tightly interwoven, and unforeseen consequences often emerge. The only certainty is that changes will be greater than intended, right? The law of unintended, consequences. And so what is the conservative calculus on, related to innovation? Innovation always entails certain losses and possible gain. Second, the more closely an innovation resembles growth, the less likely it is to result in the preponderance of loss. Third, an innovative response to some specific defect is more desirable than one springing from a desire to improve general circumstances. Fourth, conservatives should have a preference for a slow over a rapid pace of change. 5, the best time for innovation is when the projected change is most likely to be limited to what is intended and least likely to be corrupted by the undesired and unmanageable consequences. Think about that. When you think about what the Department of Government Efficiency has been doing to the federal government over the last several months, all in the interests of what they're saying, efficiency. But to a large extent, what they have been doing is 2 things. One, they've been destroying those things and that spending which conservatives have long been opposed to, which nevertheless is something that by law was created and funded. But they've also been grabbing up huge amounts of data, huge amounts of identifying data from Americans, from places like Social Security. And where did that data go? Did it go to Elon Musk's companies? If it did, what are the consequences of that? Think about that. Oakeshott's view on human nature. Human beings have a natural preference for the path of least resistance. Change is not accepted because humans like it, but rather because it's inevitable. Whenever a firm identity is at risk, a conservative disposition is likely to prevail. He attributes the idea to adolescence, passé de risque, passé de plaisir, which is no risk, no pleasure. In Americanized terms, it would be no risk, no reward. That is not how most people view the world, according to Oakeshott. He's basically saying that most human beings are fairly risk-averse. If given an enormous opportunity to maybe have a huge payday, but at enormous risk where you could lose everything, most human beings are reluctant to undertake that kind of leap. He argues that is kind of encoded into human nature. There are very few people who are so risk acceptant as to be, potentially reckless enough to risk everything. That is a young person's game, according to Oakeshott. Which is kind of, when you think about it, a lot of military people would say that the greatest generals were the younger generals. Napoleon was a young man when he won most of his great victories. In the profession of chess, most people recognize that chess is a young man's game. It requires a rapidity of calculation that gradually escapes older people, even when they remain masters. He offers a critique of modernity as a manifestation of a disposable society. The modern disposition to back individual fancies with little calculation and no appreciation of loss. We are acquisitive to the point of greed. Think about the things you fill your house up with on a day-to-day basis. People in the early 20th century, before really consumerism began going crazy, most of them only had a couple of changes of clothes. Think about just how many pairs of socks, t-shirts, how many pairs of underwear do you have? That is a symptom of what Oakeshott thinks of just this sense in which we are just buying things that we wear for a few months and then we just toss. One activity views with one another in being up to date, right? In other words, again, we are judging one another as to how current we are with whatever technology or whatever new thing or whatever show is being watched. The conservative is often portrayed not as an alternative to the progressive habit, but either as an unfortunate hindrance to the movement or as the custodian of the museum in which quaint examples of superseded achievement are preserved for children to gape at. Here, again, you have Michael Oakeshott, the conservative, expressing the grievance of a conservative, right? That they are unappreciated in their time. What are some of the emblems of a conservative disposition? For Oakeshott, activities that are undertaken primarily by virtue of a conservative disposition are kind of illustrative of how conservatives behave. The importance of friendship as attachment that springs from an intimation of familiarity and subsists in a mutual sharing of personalities. This is a great quote. Friends are not concerned with what might be made of one another, but only with the enjoyment of one another. We're not talking about networking. We're talking about friendship here. One friend cannot replace another. There is all the difference in the world between the death of a friend and the retirement of one's tailor from business. Another great quote. And what is true of friendship is not less true of other experiences, of patriotism, for example, and of conversation, each of which demands a conservative disposition as a condition of its enjoyment. Think about again why, what is so horrible about this assassination of Charlie Kirk, right? Charlie Kirk's whole point was about engagement. Now, I'm not persuaded that Charlie Kirk was always engaging in ways that were great. Okay, he oftentimes seemed to be ridiculing the people that he was interacting with. But nevertheless, he was engaging with them. He was attempting to converse. He was attempting to, win people over. That's important. That's something that we seem to be losing. And I think social media has something to do with it. He talks about the importance of intrinsically enjoyable activities. People who care only about catching fish only do it one way, right? Professional fishermen go out with nets, right? They're doing it on an industrial scale because their ability to make money depends on it. The person that he's talking about is the fly fisherman that spends his evening meticulously, kind of fashioning flies, right? People who fish for the sake of fishing do it for its own sake. If you go fishing and never catch a single fish in an entire day, but still want to go do it the next day, that's what he's talking about. When an activity takes on ritual form and a conservative disposition is appropriate. Think about the movie A River Runs Through It, right? That is, that is kind of what he's kind of talking about. All activities where what is sought is enjoyment springing not from the success of the enterprise, but from the familiarity of the engagement, are emblems of the disposition to be conservative. So how does all this manifest into politics? Conservative dispositions have nothing to do with natural law, morals, or tradition. The conservative recognizes that government is a specific and limited activity. The office of government is not to impose other beliefs and activities upon its subjects, not to tutor or educate them, not to make them better or happier in another way. For Oakeshott, the image of the ruler is the umpire. Again, I ask you to see what is going on in America today and to try to reconcile it with Oakeshott's notion of what it means to be conservative. Oakeshott argues that a conservative view, or at least the view of conservatism that he is articulating, would result in a smaller and less pretentious view of government for adults. Conservatives believe the task of government is to protect its subjects against the nuisance of those who spend their energy and wealth in the service of some pet indignation. We tolerate monomaniacs. It is our habit to do so. But why should we be ruled by them? I think that is an awesome question, right? Conservatives accept government has a role, but that role is primarily to preserve the peace. And so necessarily, again, for Oakeshott, you would have a smaller government. Conservative government does not begin with the vision of another different and better world, but with the observation of the self-government practiced even by men of passion in the conduct of their enterprises. In short, intimations of government are not to be found in ritual, or are to be found in ritual, not in religion or philosophy. He's talking about things like, again, the oath of office and honoring your oath of office. That, to me, is again, something that we seem to be missing. Innovations in government. I think he acknowledges that, as government, as people, there are more people, there are more technologies. Innovations are acceptable to the conservative only when required for the rules to remain appropriate to the activities they govern. Conservatives will avoid innovations designed to meet a purely hypothetical need. Conservatives will and should be suspicious of proposals for change in excess of what the situation calls for, of rulers who demand extraordinary power in order to make great things. And again, you have Trump's constant declarations of emergencies. The politician of conservative disposition understands the business of governing is not to inflame passion and give it new objects to feed upon. And I recall you back to what is going on right now. The outrage machine. He invokes Joseph Conrad's the shadow line. The discipline required to assert and maintain a conservative disposition is demanding. Everyone's youth is a kind of dream, and politics is an encounter in dreams in which humans hope to impose their own wills. And Conrad in his essay posits a shadow line, a passage from youth to adulthood. Once past, we see a solid world of things, each with its fixed shape, each with its own point of balance, each with its price, a world of fact, not poetic image, in which we have spent on one thing and we cannot spend on another, a world inhabited by others besides ourselves who cannot be reduced to mere reflections of our emotions. That's that's, I don't know of any, I don't know of any ideological perspective that could not read that essay and not be moved, and not say, yeah, that's a valid point of view. So let's move on and talk a little bit about conservatism today. Again, increasingly a house divided. There are a variety of contemporary manifestations of conservatism that we should be aware of and see how they fit together and see how they oftentimes don't fit together. So you have a variety of and one, we can talk about one of the main kind of zones of distinction are between, again, those conservative traditions, those conservative, traditional conservatives who, again, follow this Burkean pursuit of ordered liberty, which, Oakeshott is a good exemplar, that politics consists of attending to the arrangements of one's society. And then you have individualist conservatives who believe in the virtues of a free market society and in defense of private property. And you have, again, a belief in society as a rough and tumble competitive marketplace, the primacy of property rights, which form really the rationale for for the Republican opposition to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And you see the emergence in the 1970s of Reaganism in the United States and Thatcherism in the United Kingdom as, again, largely oriented around an individualist conservative perspective. So let's talk a little bit about Russell Kirk. He is a guy who, again, conservative from the middle of the 20th century. He exerted an enormous amount of influence over the formation of American conservatism in reaction to the New Deal. Like Oakeshott, he's arguing that it cannot be reduced to a mere dogma. There is not some formula. It's neither a religion nor an ideology, although it is an ideology. He advocated the use of conservatism as an adjective. And he notes that there is not a canon of conservative convictions. Nevertheless, he offers these 10 basic principles of American conservatism. The first principle is that most conservatives believe that there is an existing and enduring moral order. And that again reflects the idea that most conservatives have, appeal to some kind of religious underpinning. And more often than not, it is from the more doctrinaire, manifestations of Catholicism on the one hand, or some of the more dogmatic, manifestations of Protestantism, especially the Southern Baptists. Second, the conservative adheres to custom, convention, and continuity. And again, this reflects what we've been talking about throughout this point, which is that customs should, we ignore customs at our peril. And conservatives should always rise in the defense of custom. Third, conservatives believe in what may be called the principle of prescription. And that is, again, a reference to things well established by immemorial usage. And he evokes the idea of property rights. Again, he argues also that our moral beliefs are largely prescriptive in nature. He argues that conservatives are also guided by the principle of prudence. Now, what is prudence? It is basically, a desire to be cautious in making judgments. In politics, conservatives should evaluate measures by their long-term consequences. For Kirk, I love this quote: "Providence moves slowly, but the devil always hurries." Human society being complex, remedies cannot be simple if they are to be efficacious. The conservative declares that he acts only after sufficient reflection, having weighed the consequences. Sudden and slashing reforms are as perilous as sudden and slashing surgery. My colleagues up in my department are oftentimes joking. I say, I have to go get my hair cut. And they say, well, we can do that. And I said one time, I joked, I said, well, I have to go have surgery. And they, well, we're doctors, we can do that. And I'm like, well, you're not one of those kinds of doctors. Likewise, again, I recall you to Doge. Would a Russell Kirk have looked at this and said, moving fast and breaking things is the way to manage government? The fifth principle, conservatives pay attention to the principle of variety. That reflects the conservative desire to preserve long-standing social institutions and modes of life, and a hostility to the narrowing uniformity and deadening egalitarianism of radical systems. The only true form of equality are equality at the last judgment and equality before a just court of law. All other attempts at leveling must lead at best to social stagnation. That is the conservative belief. Conservatives also are chastened by their principle of imperfectibility. And again, that reflects the belief that no perfect social order is achievable. For Kirk, the argument is that to seek utopia is to end in disaster. Ninth, conservatives are persuaded that freedom and property are closely linked. The eighth one, conservatives uphold voluntary community quite as they oppose involuntary collectivism. The last two, the conservative perceives the need for prudent restraints upon power and upon human passions. And finally, the thinking conservatives understands that permanence and change must be recognized and reconciled in a vigorous society. So who affirms those principles? He's basically saying, well, Marxists don't, and we can't be Marxists. What interests back the conservative element in American politics? He's arguing that conservatism defies the usual demographic classifications. The moving power behind the renewal of conservatism is the impulse for survival. And again, this reflects the sense in which by the time Russell Kirk was writing, conservatism had been at its lowest ebb for quite a period of time. Another, important kind of articulator of this is Eric Voegelin, who famously argued that the great line of demarcation in modern politics was between liberalism on the one side and totalitarianism on the other. Kirk rejects that and basically says that for him, on one side are people entirely consumed by the current temporal order and their material needs, and on the other side are those who recognize an enduring moral order in the universe, a constant human nature, and high duties toward the order spiritual and the order temporal. So another kind of, articulator of conservatism is Ronald Reagan, who again, kind of was the first genuinely ideologically conservative president of the modern era. Certainly you had Eisenhower and Nixon before him, and Ford for that matter, but none of those three really were viewed by conservatives as sufficiently conservative. When you look at Ronald Reagan's first inaugural address, he traces the unique circumstances of the late 70s and basically argued that this was a culmination of liberalism, of liberal tax and spend policies. He argued that those economic circumstances, and again, he's talking about us having been caught within a spiral that we called stagflation for quite a period of time, where there was both high unemployment and rising prices, which was confounding economists of that period because you usually didn't see that. And so, Reagan argues it took us decades to get here. It's going to take a long time. You can't solve it immediately. The big quotation line from Reagan's first inaugural address is, "In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem." And he is advocating as a solution the devolution revolution. We are a nation that has a government, not the other way around. He was calling for a return of power from the federal government back to the state governments. He also rejected in his first inaugural address the declinism that was prevalent in the 1980s. And he argued that the answer to America's problems is freedom, giving Americans the opportunity to be worthy of themselves. Another important speech that Reagan gives was remarks that he gave at the annual convention of the National Association of Evangelicals. This particular convention was held on March 8th, 1983 in Orlando, Florida. It marked the first time that an American president publicly addressed this convention of evangelical Christians, and it consolidated the alliance between the Christian right and the Republican Party. And so he begins by saying that the American experiment with democracy depends on the realization that we are seeking the blessings of God. And he quotes Alexis de Tocqueville, who said, "Not until I went into American churches did I understand the greatness and genius of America." And he argued for, and he was, harnessing the grievances of evangelical Christians against modern day secularism. This is one of the reasons why Reagan is such a revered figure among American evangelicals. And so a famous quote from that speech: "Freedom prospers when religion is vibrant and the rule of law under God is acknowledged." And so he makes the argument that there is a wall of hostility to this sort of argument, and he offers, and he basically is talking about the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, which basically says there will not be an established religion. American presidents, going back well into towards the founding, resolutely attempted to avoid making overt expressions of any particular sectarian religious fidelity. Reagan offers a conservative interpretation of the Establishment Clause. Reagan actually argued for a constitutional amendment to restore prayer in public schools. His conservative interpretation of the Establishment Clause was basically that we would be a sectarian state. He also, in this speech, denounced abortion on demand and believed that we were in the midst of a great awakening. And again, all of these things are familiar to people who have been living, with the modern Republican Party. These are this is the central template of Reaganism as it relates to domestic politics. He also, again, made remarks about, again, godless communism. He used his remarks before this evangelical group to, kind of reestablish his bona fides as an anti-communist. He notes the Soviet Union's doctrines rejecting any morality that proceeds from supernatural ideas. He notes that Marxist-Leninism has a Machiavellian acceptance that the ends justifies the means. He calls for the prayers for those for salvation for those living under totalitarian rule. And it's important to keep in mind, before he ever entered politics, when he was president of the Screen Actors Guild, that he was part of the Red Scare, of the second Red Scare. He turned in members of the Guild that he believed were members of the Communist Party. His farewell address is a long encomium to his 8 years of government, and it's important to keep in mind, as he left office in 1989, his approval ratings remained relatively high, but he had gone through some serious scandals, in particular the Iran-Contra affair. He talks about the powers of three simple words: we, the people. He spends a great deal of time speaking about the 60s and the tumult of the 1960s. It's important to keep in mind, Ronald Reagan was his brand of conservatism emerged as a backlash to the 1960s. He was the guy that people looked to, as sort of the opposite of the hippies and yippies that characterized the 1960s and the early 1970s. And he made the argument that I think, again, is very common in conservative quarters, that as government expands, liberty contracts, and nothing is less free than pure communism. And again, this is something that you begin to see articulated even in contemporary politics. I would make the point, and I'll make this point again in a later presentation. Elon Musk, basically, when he spoke for at length in the Oval Office, when he was talking about what Doge was doing, he made the argument that there is bureaucracy and there is democracy. And that you can have one or the other, and that reflects really what Silicon Valley people think about bureaucracy, and it does reflect the negative aspect of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy's relationship with democracy is not a purely beneficial one. Nevertheless, bureaucracy is an essential feature of modern government, and can it become sclerotic? Yeah, it can, but well-managed bureaucracy is how large governments implement policy. And without bureaucracy, you don't get effective and efficient policy implementation. And so, Musk is really reflecting what is, I think, a Silicon Valley preference for disruption over democracy, which I view as fundamentally dangerous. The last slide I'm going to tell you, relating to again Ronald Reagan, is this. Again, as part of his farewell address, is this idea of a new patriotism, and that is again this resurgence of national pride. But he argues it won't count for much unless it's grounded in thoughtfulness and knowledge. Informed patriotism demands effective teaching of what it means to be an American. And, as we were, again, he was leaving office in 1989, on the cusp of the entrance into the last decade of the last, of the 20th century. Reagan, criticized the ambivalence of American education and culture regarding patriotism. And I think that's something that we can dwell upon. What does it mean to be a patriot? Certainly, I think it's important and I think most Americans do love their country. I think, I can tell you, I was born and raised on a military base. From the time I was in kindergarten through junior high school, I was on a military installation at school, and what it means to be an American was an important part of that education. I didn't notice this enormous disjuncture between, school on a military base and public education, going into high school in the South. I still think, I don't think I didn't experience in public education the kinds of things that a lot of conservatives criticize about public education. I find that, I didn't see it. So I certainly didn't experience it. And I think it's important to be, cognizant of the fact that you can love your country and still note its defects. The United States is a great country, not because it's never been challenged and not because it's never, failed in important ways, but because it has overcome those challenges. The United States emerged with one half of the country dedicated to the preservation, to the institution of slavery. And we fought a war to overcome that. We amended our Constitution to heal that defect. How we go about accommodating these fundamental differences of culture among us is going to be our crucible. This will be how America will be known in 100 years. How did we figure out how to accommodate these challenges that we confront as Americans? I think that's an important challenge. And I think we have to note the way in which ideology is making that harder. And technologies like social media are doing far more to divide us than to provide us with the grounds for accommodation. And there are some things that we should not be prepared to accommodate. Tolerance is not a suicide pact. We shouldn't be prepared to accommodate what I would say is cruelty, and overt discrimination. We have to find a way to be better than that, and that's going to be what we become as a country. The decisions we're making right now are going to affect us for generations. And on that happy note, I will close my discussion. When we come back, we will continue talking about conservatism, what it means, what the different kinds of conservatism can imply, and how conservatives view the world. I'll see you next time.